Giving is a timeless principle that spans across various cultures and religions, but in the Bible, it holds a special place of significance. When we talk about tithing, many instantly think of the modern practice of setting aside a portion of income to support church functions or charities. However, the concept of tithing has its roots in ancient times, stretching back thousands of years into the Old Testament. While today we often see tithing as a general duty, the reality is that the Bible outlines a much more intricate system, one that goes far beyond just giving money. What most people may not realize is that in the Old Testament, tithing wasn't just a singular act. It was a multifaceted practice with diverse purposes and distinct requirements. In the Bible, tithing was more than an individual's personal offering. It was a communal practice that served both religious and societal roles. It wasn't merely about fulfilling an obligation, but about honoring God and supporting the community. For the people of Israel, tithing was closely intertwined with their relationship with God and the welfare of their society. It was a means to express faith, support the spiritual leaders, and ensure that no one in their community was left behind. Through these practices, we see a deeper layer of divine wisdom in how God instructed his people to manage their resources. Before continuing, I would like to invite you to subscribe to this channel if you don't mind. By doing so, you'll stay connected with more educational and spiritually enriching content like this. Your support also helps us continue spreading Christ's love and teachings to others who seek it. So if you haven't already, take a moment to click the subscribe button and become part of our growing community. But what exactly made these tithes unique in ancient Israel? What were the motivations behind these laws, and how did they shape the everyday lives of the people? To answer these questions, we need to step back and examine the cultural and historical context of the Old Testament period. When God delivered his commandments to the Israelites, he wasn't just establishing rules for worship. He was creating a blueprint for a just and righteous society. The laws of tithing were part of a broader system designed to promote social justice, community worship, and faithful stewardship. Each form of giving had a specific function, tailored to meet different needs and to reinforce different values. One of the things that stands out about the Old Testament is how detailed and organized the laws were regarding tithing. These commands were not arbitrary, they were deeply thoughtful and practical. They weren't just about transferring wealth, but about creating a rhythm of giving that fostered unity, generosity, and spiritual growth. The Israelites didn't just see tithing as a financial transaction. It was a sacred duty that connected them to one another and to God in a tangible way. Every aspect, from what was to be given to who would benefit from it, was meticulously outlined, showing that God cared about the details of their faith and the structure of their society. For modern readers, understanding these ancient practices can seem like trying to piece together a puzzle from a distant time. Many of us are familiar with the idea of tithing as a tenth of our income. But in the Old Testament, this principle had different layers and applications. The various instructions around giving weren't random acts of kindness or charity. They were structured obligations meant to ensure the well-being of the entire community, from the priests who served in the temple to the poor and vulnerable. This raises the question, why did God prescribe these particular forms of tithing, and what does it tell us about his character and priorities? To grasp the significance of tithing in the Old Testament, we need to first understand the broader picture of ancient Israel's social and religious life. Unlike today's world, where societies operate on complex economic systems, ancient Israel was a predominantly agricultural society. Their livelihoods depended heavily on the land, and as such, their offerings often came in the form of crops, livestock, and produce. Because of this, the concept of increase was not measured by salaries or monetary gains, but by the yield of the land and the health of their herds. This is why we see so many references in the Bible to grain, wine, and oil, rather than silver and gold. Tithing was directly connected to the agricultural cycle and the blessing of the land that God had given them. Moreover, tithing was more than just a personal expression of faith. It was a national act of obedience that reflected the Israelites' covenant relationship with God. Each tithe served as a reminder that everything they possessed ultimately came from Him. By faithfully following these commands, the Israelites demonstrated their trust in God's provision and acknowledged His sovereignty over their lives. It was an act of reverence and gratitude, but it also required careful planning and intentionality. Every harvest season, families would meticulously count out their produce, set aside the required portions, and bring them to designated places of worship or distribute them to the needy as prescribed by the law. This practice wasn't always easy, especially during times of drought or poor harvests, but it was a vital part of their identity and faith. It called for self-discipline and a willingness to give, even when resources seemed scarce. In fact, one of the reasons the prophets often rebuked the Israelites was for neglecting these laws. When the people turned away from tithing, it wasn't just about failing to meet a quota. It was a sign that their hearts had grown distant from God and from the needs of their community. By failing to tithe, they broke a chain of generosity and provision that had been set in place to sustain their nation. Now, let us break down the distinct types of tithes outlined in the Old Testament and uncover the role each played in the spiritual and communal life of Israel. 1. The Levitical Tithe. In the Old Testament, the most well-known form of tithe is the Levitical Tithe. It was named after the Levites, a specific tribe within Israel, who had a unique role and responsibility among the people of God. This tithe is often considered the foundation of all tithing practices in the Bible. However, its true meaning and function can be misunderstood if we don't consider its historical and cultural context. By looking deeper into how this tithe worked, we uncover its essential role in supporting worship, spiritual leadership, and maintaining the religious life of Israel. To understand the significance of the Levitical tithe, we need to first look at who the Levites were and what made them different from the other tribes of Israel. The Levites were one of the 12 tribes, but unlike the others, they were set apart to serve in the tabernacle and later, the temple. God did not give them a separate portion of land, as He did with the other tribes. Instead, He designated them to assist the priests and handle the sacred responsibilities in the sanctuary. Their main focus was to perform duties related to worship, maintain the holy objects, and teach the law to the people. Because of these special duties, they were not allowed to work regular jobs or farm the land like the rest of the Israelites. So, the question naturally arises, how were they supposed to support themselves and their families? The answer was the Levitical tithe. According to Numbers 18, verse 21 to 24, God commanded that 1/10 of all the produce and livestock from the other 11 tribes be given to the Levites as their inheritance. This tithe served as their source of income, enabling them to fully dedicate their lives to ministry without needing to worry about their daily needs. The Israelites were instructed to set aside 10% of their crops, fruits, and animals and bring it to the Levites at designated times. This system was not just a practical solution for supporting the Levites. It was also a way of acknowledging their sacred role and God's provision for His servants. Through this tithe, the people of Israel demonstrated their respect for the work that the Levites were doing in the service of the Lord. One important aspect to note is that this tithe was not optional. It was a command from God, and failing to pay it was seen as a form of disobedience and neglect of their spiritual responsibilities. The people were not merely donating out of generosity, they were returning to God what He had designated as holy. In essence, the tithe was a form of worship, expressing gratitude and obedience to God's instructions. By providing for the Levites, the Israelites were honoring God's structure for spiritual leadership and ensuring that the work of the tabernacle continued without interruption. But what exactly did this tithe look like in practice? During harvest time, families would gather their crops and set apart 1/10 of everything: the grains, fruits, vegetables, and even herbs. For those raising livestock, this meant counting out every 10th animal from their flocks and herds. The Bible describes a very specific and careful method for measuring and setting aside the tithe, highlighting its importance. It wasn't about giving the leftovers or what was convenient. The first and the best portions were selected as an acknowledgement that everything ultimately belonged to God. This process served as a reminder that the source of their prosperity was not their own efforts, but God's blessing on their labor. Once the tithe was separated, the people would bring it to the designated Levitical cities. According to Joshua 21, there were 48 cities scattered throughout Israel that were given to the Levites to live in. These cities were strategically located so that the Levites would be spread out among the people, maintaining a strong presence in every region. The tithe collected from the surrounding areas would be brought to these cities, where it was stored and distributed among the Levites and their families. This ensured that they had a steady supply of food and resources throughout the year. Beyond just supporting the Levites, the tithe also had a deeper spiritual purpose. It was a visible expression of Israel's commitment to the covenant relationship they had with God. By giving a portion of their increase, the people were symbolically giving back to God, acknowledging His sovereignty over all they possessed. This tithe system was more than just an economic transaction. It was a spiritual discipline that kept the people focused on God as the ultimate provider. It fostered a culture of dependence on God and gratitude for His blessings, which was central to the faith of ancient Israel. However, the Levitical tithe did not stop with the Levites. Once the Levites received the tithe, they were instructed to set aside a tenth of what they received and offer it to the priests. This is known as the tithe of the tithe. The Levites, despite being the recipients of the people's offerings, were also required to tithe. According to Numbers 18:26-28, the Levites would take the best portions of the tithe and present it to the priests, who were a subgroup of the Levites descended from Aaron. This practice ensured that even those who were dedicated to serving in God's house participated in the act of giving. It was a way of demonstrating that no one, not even the religious leaders, was exempt from honoring God with their possessions. The tithe of the tithe was crucial for maintaining the service in the tabernacle. The priests, unlike the regular Levites, had the highest responsibilities in the sanctuary. They offered sacrifices, performed the rituals, and acted as mediators between God and the people. Because of their direct role in the most sacred activities, they were to receive the choicest parts of the offerings. This practice emphasized the principle that giving to God must involve our best, not just what is left over. It also reinforced the idea that everyone, regardless of their position, had a role in sustaining the worship and ministry of God's people. The careful organization of this tithe system speaks volumes about the values that God was instilling in His people. First, it upheld the principle of provision for those who serve. The Levites and priests, being fully devoted to spiritual duties, had no other means of support, and it was the responsibility of the other tribes to care for them. Second, it established the principle of reciprocal giving. Even though the Levites were recipients, they too were givers, showing that no one was above the call to generosity. Lastly, it served as a continual reminder of God's ownership of everything. The people were giving what was already His, and in doing so, they were renewing their covenant relationship with Him. The Levitical tithe, therefore, was more than just an economic support system. It was a foundational element in the spiritual life of Israel. It connected the people to their religious leaders and to God in a meaningful way. Every time they gave, they were reminded of God's holiness, the sacredness of worship, and their communal responsibility. This tithe created a bond between the people, the Levites, and the priests, reflecting the unity and order that God desired for His people. By fulfilling this duty, the Israelites participated in a cycle of giving and receiving that sustained the worship and teaching of the law, keeping the flame of faith alive in their nation. But like many aspects of the Old Testament law, the practice of the Levitical tithe wasn't always kept faithfully. Throughout the history of Israel, there were periods when the people neglected their tithing obligations. When this happened, the Levites were forced to abandon their duties in the tabernacle and return to farming or other forms of labor just to survive. This led to a breakdown in the spiritual life of the nation. We see examples of this in the books of Nehemiah and Malachi, where the prophets had to rebuke the people for failing to support the Levites. This neglect was not just a financial issue, it was a spiritual crisis. When the people failed to provide for the Levites, they were essentially turning away from God's order and priorities. However, during times of spiritual renewal, one of the first signs of repentance was the restoration of the tithe. The people would gather their produce, bring it to the Levites, and the service in the tabernacle would be revived. This pattern shows us just how central the Levitical tithe was to the health of Israel's faith and worship. Without it, the Levites could not fulfill their role, and the entire structure of religious life would start to crumble. The tithe was not just about meeting a financial need. It was about maintaining a system that allowed the people to worship, learn, and live according to God's design. Second tithe, the Festival Tithe. The second type of tithe found in the Old Testament is known as the Festival Tithe. While the Levitical tithe was primarily focused on supporting the Levites and priests, the Festival Tithe served an entirely different purpose. Its goal was not to sustain religious leaders, but rather to promote joy, fellowship, and worship among the entire community of Israel. The Festival Tithe stands out because it brought a sense of celebration and unity, highlighting the importance of coming together as a people to rejoice before God. Through this practice, we see how the act of giving was also a way of honoring God with gratitude and shared experiences. To understand the Festival Tithe, we need to look at the instructions given in Deuteronomy 14:22-27. In this passage, God commands the Israelites to set aside 1/10 of their produce, just like with the Levitical tithe. However, instead of giving it to the Levites, this tithe was meant to be consumed by the people themselves at a central location during the major religious festivals. These festivals were annual events, including the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Feast of Weeks, Pentecost, and the Feast of Tabernacles. Each festival had its own unique focus and rituals, but they all shared a common purpose: to celebrate God's blessings and to build community among the people. The Festival Tithe was about making these celebrations possible, and it involved more than just setting aside produce. Families were to bring the best of their harvests: grains, wine, olive oil, and even livestock like sheep and cattle, to the place where God chose for His name to dwell, which was initially the tabernacle and later the temple in Jerusalem. Once there, the Israelites would use these offerings to prepare a grand feast, which was shared among family, friends, and even strangers. It was a time for singing, dancing, and giving thanks, all centered around the common bond of worshiping God. Unlike other tithes that were given away, the Festival Tithe was consumed by the givers themselves in a spirit of joy and worship. This distinction is significant because it reveals that God is not just concerned with solemn obedience, but also with the joyful expression of gratitude. The people were not merely fulfilling a duty. They were celebrating the abundance God had provided. They were to eat and rejoice before the Lord, acknowledging that everything they enjoyed was a result of His goodness. The Festival Tithe was, in essence, an invitation from God to His people to celebrate life and faith together. But these celebrations were not just personal, they were collective. Each family, no matter how small or large, was expected to make the journey to the designated place of worship and partake in the festival. For many, this meant traveling long distances, which could be a significant challenge, especially for those living far from Jerusalem. Understanding this, God made provisions to ensure that everyone could participate. In Deuteronomy 14:24-26, God provides an alternative for those who live too far away to transport all their goods. If the journey was too long and carrying the produce or livestock was too burdensome, they were allowed to sell their tithe, convert it into silver, and then bring the money to the festival. Once there, they could use the silver to purchase whatever they desired, whether it be food, wine, or livestock, so that they could still hold the feast and celebrate with others. This flexibility shows God's sensitivity to the practical needs of His people while still preserving the spirit of the command. The focus was not on the technicalities of what was given, but on the heart behind the giving and the act of celebration. Whether they brought their own goods or purchased them at the festival, the people were to use these resources to honor God and enjoy the time together. This practice ensured that no one felt excluded because of distance or logistical difficulties. Everyone was welcome at the table, and everyone had something to contribute to the shared joy of worship. The festival tithe was also unique because it encouraged the inclusion of all members of society, especially those who might otherwise be overlooked. In Deuteronomy 16:11-14, God specifically commands the Israelites to include the Levites, the foreigners, the orphans, and the widows in their celebrations. These were the groups who had no land or regular means of income, making it difficult for them to provide for themselves. By inviting them to the feast, the people were demonstrating the value of hospitality and compassion, which were core to God's teachings. This ensured that the blessings of the land were shared with everyone, not just those who were well off. Including these vulnerable groups was not a matter of charity. It was a declaration that all were equal before God. It reinforced the principle that the community was to reflect God's character by caring for one another. When the Israelites gathered for these feasts, it was not just the wealthy or the powerful who had a place at the table. The presence of the Levites, foreigners, orphans, and widows made the festival complete, turning the gathering into a true celebration of unity and shared blessings. The festival tithe thus became a powerful symbol of how God's people were to live, not in isolation or hierarchy, but in inclusive and joyful fellowship. The emphasis on joy is a striking feature of the festival tithe. Unlike other forms of giving that might have felt burdensome, this tithe was meant to be a delight. In Deuteronomy 14, verse 26, God explicitly tells the people to spend the tithe on whatever your heart desires, whether it be oxen, sheep, wine, or strong drink. This statement might surprise some readers because it seems to suggest indulgence, but the purpose was not to promote selfishness. It was to show that God took pleasure in their pleasure when it was rooted in thankfulness and shared in the context of worship. The people were to enjoy the fruit of their labor, recognizing that God was the source of their prosperity. This joyful celebration had a deeper purpose as well. By gathering for these festivals and sharing the tithe together, the people were renewing their covenant relationship with God. Every meal, every song, and every act of sharing was a reminder of God's faithfulness and their identity as His chosen people. It was a way to remember the past, celebrate the present, and look forward to the future promises of God. The festival tithe, therefore, was not just about eating and drinking. It was a profound act of communal worship that strengthened their faith and their bonds with one another. However, these joyful gatherings also had a time of preparation. Setting aside the festival tithe required intentionality and planning. Throughout the year, families would have to be mindful of this tithe as they harvested their crops and tended their flocks. It wasn't a last-minute decision or an afterthought. They had to keep track of what was set aside and ensure that it was the best portion, untainted, unblemished, and worthy of the celebration. This discipline of preparing and anticipating the festival season created a rhythm of expectation and gratitude. By the time the festival arrived, the people were ready, both materially and spiritually, to enter into a time of worship and joy. But what happened if someone neglected this tithe or failed to attend the festival? Unlike the Levitical tithe, which had severe consequences for neglect, the festival tithe carried a different kind of weight. It wasn't about depriving the Levites of their support. It was about depriving oneself of the joy and fellowship that came from obeying God's command. Neglecting the festival tithe meant missing out on the opportunity to experience the fullness of worship and the richness of community life. It was a missed chance to celebrate God's goodness in the company of fellow believers, which was itself a form of spiritual loss. The significance of this tithe becomes even more evident when we consider the context of the festivals themselves. The major festivals in Israel's calendar were designed to remind the people of key events in their history, such as the Exodus from Egypt or the giving of the law at Mount Sinai. These were not just random holidays. They were deeply tied to Israel's identity and faith story. By bringing the festival tithe to these gatherings, the people were actively participating in the remembrance of God's mighty acts and reaffirming their trust in His provision. It was a way of keeping their history alive and passing it on to future generations. Moreover, the festival tithe played a vital role in uniting the tribes of Israel. Because the festivals required everyone to gather at a central location, often in Jerusalem, they served as a point of connection for people from different regions and backgrounds. The shared experience of worship, feasting, and fellowship helped to strengthen the bonds between the tribes and create a sense of national unity. The tithe, which was used to fund these gatherings, was a tangible expression of their commitment to one another and to God. It ensured that the blessings of the land flowed freely among the people, preventing divisions and promoting harmony. The third and final type of tithe outlined in the Old Testament is the poor tithe. Unlike the Levitical and Festival tithes, which were meant to support the spiritual leaders and foster communal celebration, the poor tithe had a very different focus. Its purpose was to provide for those who were most vulnerable in society: the widows, orphans, foreigners, and the poor. This tithe was a direct expression of God's concern for justice and compassion, ensuring that no one was left without support. Through this practice, God established a way for the community to care for its most marginalized members, making generosity and social responsibility an integral part of Israel's life and worship. The instructions for the poor tithe are found in Deuteronomy 14 verse 28 to 29 and Deuteronomy 26, 12 to 15. Unlike the other tithes, which were given annually, the poor tithe was collected every third year in a 7-year cycle. This meant that in the first, second, fourth, and fifth years, the people would pay the Levitical and Festival tithes. But in the third and sixth years, instead of setting aside a tenth of their produce for these regular tithes, they would dedicate that portion to the poor tithe. This tithe was specifically designated to meet the needs of those who had no land, income, or means of providing for themselves. By structuring it this way, God ensured that the needs of the vulnerable were systematically and consistently addressed. The poor tithe was a practical response to the reality that not everyone in Israel had the same opportunities or resources. While most of the tribes were given land as an inheritance, which they could farm and pass down through generations, certain groups did not have such privileges. Widows, for example, had no inheritance if their husbands died. Orphans were often left without a family to care for them, and foreigners, people who lived among the Israelites but were not part of the covenant community, had no claim to land or steady work. These groups were particularly at risk of falling into extreme poverty and suffering. The poor tithe was a way to provide for their basic needs and to include them in the blessings of the land. Unlike other tithes, the poor tithe was not brought to the tabernacle or the temple. Instead, it was stored locally in the towns and villages where the people lived. The produce collected, grain, wine, olive oil, and other foodstuffs, was kept in a communal storehouse from which the poor and needy could draw as needed. This local distribution system made the tithe more accessible to those who needed it most. Rather than requiring the vulnerable to travel long distances to receive help, the assistance was brought to their doorstep. This approach ensured that the poor and marginalized could receive support in a dignified and convenient manner. In addition to meeting practical needs, the poor tithe also had a significant spiritual component. When the Israelites presented this tithe, they were not just fulfilling a social obligation, they were making a declaration of faith. In Deuteronomy 26, verse 13 to 15, God instructed the people to say a specific prayer when they had completed the poor tithe in the third year. This prayer was a solemn affirmation that they had followed God's commandments, cared for the needy, and maintained purity in their giving. It ended with a request for God's continued blessing on the land and the people. This prayer shows that the poor tithe was not merely a charitable act, it was an act of worship, done in obedience to God's command and in hope of His favor. The emphasis on obedience is particularly evident in the way this tithe was structured. Because it was given only once every 3 years, it required a special kind of discipline and intentionality. The people had to remember the cycle and plan ahead, ensuring that in the third and sixth years, they were prepared to set aside a full tenth of their increase for the poor. This was not a spontaneous or casual act of giving. It was a deliberate and well-organized practice, reflecting the seriousness with which God viewed the care of the vulnerable. By establishing this rhythm, God was teaching his people to prioritize the needs of others and to see generosity as a regular, ongoing part of their lives. Moreover, the poor tithe was not just for times of plenty. It was to be given faithfully even in lean years. This expectation was a testament to God's desire for his people to trust him with their resources, regardless of their circumstances. It was easy to give when the harvest was abundant, but it was much harder to share when crops were scarce. Yet, the poor tithe was still required, reinforcing the idea that the needs of the vulnerable were not optional, but essential. This practice tested the faith and integrity of the people, challenging them to give sacrificially and to believe that God would provide for them, just as they were providing for others. One of the most remarkable aspects of the poor tithe was its inclusiveness. While other tithes were focused on supporting specific groups, like the Levites, or occasions, like the festivals, the poor tithe was broad in its scope. It did not matter whether the recipient was an Israelite by birth or a foreigner residing in the land. It did not matter whether they were male or female, young or old. As long as they were in need, they had a right to benefit from the poor tithe. This inclusivity reflected the universal nature of God's compassion and his desire that no one should be left without help. Additionally, the poor tithe helped to maintain the dignity of those who received it. By establishing a local storehouse, God created a system where the poor could come and take what they needed without shame or embarrassment. They were not beggars at the mercy of individual donors. They were participants in a communal system of support that recognized their worth and value. This arrangement affirmed that the vulnerable were not outsiders or burdens, but integral members of the community. Their presence in the land was not seen as a problem to be solved, but as an opportunity for the people of God to demonstrate his love and justice in practical ways. The poor tithe also had a broader social impact. By regularly setting aside a portion of their produce for the poor, the Israelites were reminded of their shared responsibility for the welfare of the community. This practice countered any tendency toward greed or self-centeredness, fostering a culture of generosity and mutual care. It helped prevent the kind of economic disparity and exploitation that could tear a society apart. Everyone, from the wealthiest landowner to the poorest laborer, was connected through this system of giving. The rich were taught to hold their wealth with open hands, and the poor were given a place of honor and provision in the community. This tithe, therefore, was not just about meeting immediate needs. It was about shaping a society that reflected God's values of justice, mercy, and compassion. By caring for the least among them, the Israelites were showing the world what it looked like to live under the rule of a just and loving God. The poor tithe was a testimony to God's character and his concern for those who are often overlooked or ignored. Through this practice, the people of Israel became God's hands and feet, extending his care to the most vulnerable members of society. But like the other tithes, the poor tithe was not always faithfully observed. Throughout Israel's history, there were periods when the people neglected this command, leading to increased suffering among the poor. When the prophets spoke out against Israel's sins, they often highlighted the nation's failure to care for the needy as one of the most serious offenses, neglecting the poor. Tithe was not just an economic failing. It was a moral and spiritual failing. It showed that the people's hearts had turned away from God's commands and that they were no longer living according to his standards of justice and mercy. For example, in the book of Isaiah, God condemns the people for their religious hypocrisy, saying that their sacrifices and offerings are meaningless because they have neglected the needs of the oppressed and the vulnerable. In Isaiah 1:17, he calls the people to seek justice, encourage the oppressed, defend the cause of the fatherless, and plead the case of the widow. This was a direct reference to the kind of care that the poor tithe was supposed to provide. Similarly, in the book of Amos, the prophet denounces the wealthy for trampling on the poor and turning justice into bitterness. These sharp rebukes showed just how seriously God took the neglect of the poor tithe and the failure to protect the vulnerable. But when the poor tithe was observed faithfully, it became a source of blessing, not just for the recipients, but for the entire nation. In Deuteronomy 26:15, after the people presented the poor tithe and prayed the prayer of obedience, they asked God to look down from heaven and bless your people Israel and the land you have given us. This prayer reveals the connection between generosity and God's blessing. When the people honored God by caring for the poor, they positioned themselves to receive His favor and protection. The poor tithe was a way for the community to align itself with God's will and to invite His blessings on the land and its people. Understanding the purpose and structure of the tithes in the Old Testament reveals something about the nature of giving and the heart of God. Each tithe, whether given to sustain worship, foster celebration, or provide for the vulnerable, points us to a divine principle, that true generosity flows from a heart aligned with God's character. The practices of ancient Israel were more than religious duties. They were expressions of love, obedience, and communal responsibility. And while these specific tithes may no longer be practiced today, the lessons they teach are timeless. If there's one takeaway, it's that God calls us to live with open hands and generous hearts. Our giving should be intentional, joyful, and focused on lifting up others. Whether supporting those who dedicate their lives to ministry, celebrating life's blessings with community, or caring for those in need, every act of generosity is a reflection of the God we serve, a God of justice, compassion, and abundant grace. So I challenge you, look at your resources, your time, and your influence. Ask yourself how you can use them to honor God and make a tangible impact in the lives of others. Consider supporting a local charity, helping a family in need, or investing in your community in meaningful ways. Remember, the true measure of generosity is not in the amount we give, but in the love and intention behind it. When we give, we become vessels of God's grace, pouring out His love into a world that desperately needs it. Take that step today. Be the source of blessing, the hand of provision, and the voice of encouragement. Make generosity not just an action, but a lifestyle. Let your giving tell a story of faithfulness, hope, and unwavering trust in the God who first gave to us. Together, let's create a world where no one is left behind, and every need is met by the outpouring of God's love through our open hands and willing hearts. If you found value in these insights and want to continue exploring how biblical principles can transform our lives, be sure to subscribe, like, and share. Let's grow together in understanding, faith, and generosity. Your journey of giving starts here.